Hello comrades, it's TheFinnishBolshevik. Let's talk about the arguments that Mensheviks and Right-SRs used to try to gain popular support, and also various factors which could have contributed to their support or conversely to dissatisfaction with the Bolsheviks. The first topic is Germany. The Mensheviks and SRs used deceitful demagogic arguments to try to win popularity, especially in areas near the front where German troops were, such as in Murmansk, Tambov, and Georgia, claiming that Bolsheviks were traitors to their homeland, that they were German agents, etc. Historians agree that at one point, most people in Russia and abroad believed this lie, although nowadays it has largely been abandoned, though some anti-communists still try to resurrect it. I'm not going to go deeply into the topic of the so-called German Bolshevik conspiracy here. I will make a separate video about that at some point in the future. However, I will say that definitely the biggest reasons and nearly the sole reasons why people believed in the claim that Bolsheviks were German agents were the following. 1. Forged documents created by white guards, which were debunked immediately after they were created, but nowadays they have even been debunked by bourgeois historians such as George Kennan. And 2, the even more important reason, that Lenin arrived from Germany on the so-called sealed train, meaning a special train which didn't let him meet anyone and didn't let him get out during the trip. This train deported him from Germany to Russia. Lenin was not the only one to arrive on a so-called sealed train from Germany. His rival, Menshevik Martov, also arrived on the same kind of train. So did Chernov, the leader of the Right-SRs, and a minister in the Kerensky government, the government which accused Lenin of being a German agent because he was sent on a German train. Chernov and Martov were both pro-Entente, but they still arrived on a German train. Lenin, of course, was not pro-Entente, but he was also not pro-German. Once the Bolsheviks had overthrown the capitalist government of Russia, they then tried to help German workers overthrow the German Kaiser and then the German capitalist government. The Mensheviks and SRs accused Lenin of being a German agent because he signed a peace treaty with Germany, but before signing the treaty, Lenin had made a serious examination of the conditions of the troops, and based on this examination, he had concluded that the army could not resist the German attack, so there was no choice but to make the peace. Lenin also originally did not want to make a peace only with Germany. Lenin wanted to make peace with all the belligerent countries, but none of the other countries agreed to sign. However, Lenin still did not trust the Germans despite signing the peace, and he called on the people to wage a heroic defensive war if Germany were to attack. And Lenin also ordered the immediate creation of the Red Army so that it would be ready as soon as possible to face any attack. But what were the relations of the Mensheviks, SRs and other counter-revolutionaries to the Germans? Going on the so-called sealed train was apparently actually the Menshevik leader Martov's idea. In his biography of Martov, Israel Getzler writes, quote, Martov was apparently the first to broach the idea of a deal with the German authorities to allow passages through Germany in exchange for the repatriation of German prisoners of war held in Russia, unquote. But this did not stop Martov from saying that Lenin, quote, is not only under the protection of the Red Guards, but also of Kaiser Wilhelm, unquote. The Mensheviks and SRs strongly condemned the peace treaty made by the Bolsheviks and screamed that the Bolsheviks have surrendered Ukraine and the Baltics to the Germans. But in Ukraine, and the Baltics as well, the Mensheviks actually collaborated with the German occupiers. The Mensheviks and SRs also supported the White forces in the Civil War, while White generals Krasnov and Alexeyev were armed and funded by the Germans. The Germans and the Entente actually had an implicit agreement to collaborate against the Bolsheviks. Even after Germany had been defeated by the Entente, the British told the German army to remain in the Baltic countries, which they had occupied, and to jointly repress the communists and workers there. In other words, in the Baltics, the Entente, the Germans and the Mensheviks all collaborated. Social Democrat Price writes, quote, It is true the Allies did not dare to admit openly that they were ready to use the Germans in the task they had now set before them, but it is a fact that the French commander, General Anselm, who arrived in Odessa soon after the armistice with the Central Powers, proceeded to enter into relations with all anti-Bolshevik parties that he found there. Among them was the Gromada, a pro-German group which had been formed during the German occupation. Through this group, General Anselm arranged that the German troops in the Ukraine should hold the front against the Red Army until other forces, either Allied or local Russian Whites, could be formed to take it over. That the Allies were at this time using the armed forces of the Central Powers against the Red Army is also proved by the instructions issued by the British naval forces in the Baltic. In southeast Russia, the Allies appear to have gone even further. Allied commanders of small naval and military detachments, which arrived there from the Turkish war theater in November, concluded a sort of joint agreement with the local German commander. On November 16th, the Neue Nachrichten, organ of the German forces of occupation in the Ukraine at Berdyansk, printed a manifesto of the Allied command in South Russia. It ran as follows: "We inform hereby the inhabitants of Odessa and the neighborhood that we have arrived on Russian territory with the object of restoring order and of freeing the country from the Bolshevik usurpers. Both the Germans and ourselves have come here not as conquerors but as champions of right. Hence their objects and ours are identical." Unquote. It's quite extraordinary that the Entente in this declaration literally says that their aims and the aims of the Central Powers are the same, to destroy Bolshevism, and that neither of them have come there as conquerors but only to fight the Bolsheviks. British agent Lockhart writes, quote, "The one aim of every Russian bourgeois, and 99% of the so-called loyal Russians were bourgeois, was to secure the intervention of British troops and, failing British, German troops, to re-establish order in Russia, suppress Bolshevism, and restore to the bourgeois his property." Unquote. So even this spokesperson of the British government says that practically all Russian capitalists wanted the intervention of foreign imperialist troops, and they might prefer the Entente, but if that wasn't possible, they would also accept intervention of the Central Powers in Germany. The plan of many Tsarist capitalists and also of the Menshevik-SR government of Kerensky had actually been to abandon Petrograd to the Germans. This failed because the masses said that they would arrest Kerensky if he tried to move the capital to Moscow, or if he tried to leave and go to Moscow. However, the idea that the Germans should be allowed to invade so that they would destroy the revolution was almost universal among all the capitalists and reactionaries, despite the fact that they all accused the Bolsheviks of being German agents. For instance, A.R. Williams writes, quote, "Reaction is open and arrogant. Kornilov, instead of being tried for high treason, is lauded as the great patriot by the bourgeoisie. But with them, patriotism is tawdry talk and a sham. They pray for the Germans to come and cut off Petrograd, the head of the revolution. Rodzianko, ex-president of the Duma, brazenly writes, 'Let the Germans take the city. Though they destroy the fleet, they will throttle the Soviets.' The big insurance companies announce 1/3 off in rates after the German occupation." And capitalist writer William Hard writes, quote, "Among the prominent representatives of the bourgeois class was Rodzianko. He had been a member of the Duma. He had been president of the Duma. The public press had continually reported his view of a possible German capture of Petrograd. Such a capture, according to Rodzianko, would be no great misfortune. It might indeed be a blessing. The Germans had captured Riga. Did they do any harm? They did good. They abolished the Soviet and restored the old regime police." Colonel William B. Thompson, Robin's old chief in the American Red Cross mission to Russia, had noticed this strong streak of welcome for Germany among the Russian bourgeois during his stay in Petrograd. Unquote. Another anti-communist writer named Antonelli writes, quote, "Milyukov's famous intervention in the Duma should not be forgotten when he denounced from the rostrum the plots woven for the purpose of reaching the unprecedented infamy of a separate peace. When the revolution broke out, all the elements that were reactionary or simply bourgeois turned in distress towards Germany. The anxious expectation of German support was openly advertised. We can positively state in all the clubs and in all the salons. The same Milyukov who had formerly denounced the separate peace from the rostrum of the Duma in 1918 entered into suspicious cabals with Germany in the name of his party, that is the Cadet Party. It may be stated that at the present time there is not a reactionary or a bourgeois in Moscow or Petrograd who is still not ready to give half of what is left of Russia to see order restored in these cities by the Germans. Imperialistic Germany of the Junkers and the Prussian soldiery is the sole hope of these people." Unquote. And Litvinov writes, quote, "None other than Milyukov, the well-known leader of the Russian liberals, publicly stated in the Duma, in reply to a taunt of the monarchists, that, rather than organize the country for national defense, if that should help the organization of the revolutionary forces, he would leave her as she was, that is, defenseless against the Germans." Unquote. The Mensheviks allied with the above-mentioned Milyukov, the leader of the capitalist cadet party. The Right-SRs, the Mensheviks' main ally, also plotted to have Germany occupy Petrograd in order to topple the Bolsheviks. Menshevik Lieber tried to defend the capitalists and stated that, quote, "The fact that a part of the cadet party had adopted a German orientation and had concluded an alliance with the monarchists did not mean that the entire Russian bourgeoisie was guilty of such a turnabout," unquote. But as we've seen from other sources, it was practically the entire bourgeoisie that wanted to do that. Besides, it wasn't just some cadets, it was literally the leader of the cadet party. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica says, quote, "The question of yielding to the Germans and crushing the communists with their help was eagerly discussed in connection with the plan of a monarchical restoration. The idea found favor among the Rights and was supported among the cadets by P. Milyukov, their leader, who had fled to Kiev and considered that the game was definitely lost by the Western Allies and that it was wiser to accept defeat from the Germans than from the Bolsheviks," unquote. And American historian James Bunyan writes that Milyukov wanted the restoration of the Tsar. He said that they must ally with the Germans and, quote, "The government which is to emerge must be an all-national government, monarchical in character. An effort should be made to determine the candidate for the throne at once. I would suggest the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich," unquote. That is Nikolai Romanov's brother. The facts demonstrate that not the Bolsheviks but the Mensheviks allied with forces who hoped for German intervention, and the Mensheviks also collaborated with German occupiers in those territories that they occupied. The arguments they used against the Bolsheviks were mere lies, simply trying to fool the people. The Mensheviks and SRs also tried to utilize the famine and scarcity of all resources to attack Bolshevism. They blamed everything on the Bolsheviks, often saying that the Bolsheviks have destroyed the country. However, everybody now understands that the devastation was caused by the 3 years of World War, which the Mensheviks and SRs wanted to participate in, as well as the Civil War, launched by the Whites and the Entente invaders, both of whom the Mensheviks and SRs supported. However, the scarcity of food, fuel and resources was especially caused by the embargo placed on Soviet Russia. The embargo was imposed by the Entente, that is, the allies of the Mensheviks. A writer named Birukov writes, quote, "There is a shortage of fuel, petrol is held up by the British, the Baku oil wells, and coal is held up by Denikin, who is supported by the Entente," unquote. Sadul writes, quote, "It is necessary to note in passing the vast campaign of economic encirclement, the pitiless blockade established against Russia. If the Entente is obliged to renounce all armed intervention, direct or indirect, she hopes at least to conquer Bolshevism through bringing about industrial ruin and famine. Holding in her hands the wheat granaries of Siberia, she is already beginning to starve out this unhappy country, and already she has condemned to death hundreds of thousands of innocents," unquote. Quote, "That is what is being called the economic encircling. It is the lack of food which is one of the means of the counter-revolution, by which it tries to force the Russian popular revolution to capitulate. Never has famine in Russia attained the fabulous proportions which were assigned to it by the campaign of calumnies, which was systematically worked up during the past few months. Our situation as regards the food supply is difficult and painful, and it is only with the greatest efforts that we succeed in maintaining some food allowances to the people," unquote. MP Price writes, quote, "I know that the starvation and misery from which the Russian people are suffering is due not to those who are building up the new socialist form of society, but to those who for 3 years drove Russia into an exhausting war and then sent armed forces to invade her territory and cut off her food supplies and the raw materials of her industries," unquote. The anti-Marxist philosopher Bertrand Russell, who also visited Soviet Russia, writes the following, quote, "The typical Russian peasant has never heard of the Allies or of this country. He does not know that there is a blockade. All he knows is that he used to have 6 cows, but the government reduced him to 1 for the sake of poorer peasants, and that it takes his corn, except what is needed for his own family, at a very low price. The reasons for these actions do not interest him, since his horizon is bounded by his own village," unquote. It was very convenient for the Mensheviks and SRs that they first orchestrate the embargo and the scarcity, and then try to use the scarcity to fool people into attacking Bolshevism. This again demonstrates that the SRs and Mensheviks could only hope to gain popularity by deception. A.R. Williams writes, quote, The cities were the stronghold of the Bolsheviks. The bourgeoisie and their helpers sought to play the country against them. Look, they said to the peasants, the cities work but 8 hours a day. Why should you work 16? Why deliver your grain to the cities when you get nothing in return? Unquote. A Western journalist named Lansbury writes, quote, there was another method of bribery by which opponents hoped to break the spirit and power of the Soviet government, and that was by undermining the morale of the soldiers by means of money bribes, and it is here where Allied gold came in, and where it was spent so very plentifully. Of course, this sort of thing is very difficult to track down and takes a very large number of men and women in order to do it thoroughly. Then there was the industrial side of life. Many of the leading agents of the Allies recognized that the Soviet government would not be pulled down by fighting, and so they set to work in the industrial centers to create unrest and dissatisfaction owing to the shortage of food. These agents were able to corrupt other agents, who in turn went into the factories and spread their poison, declaring that with peace there would come plenty, and that the responsibility for the interventionist civil war and the shortage lay with the Soviet government. Unquote. The Mensheviks tried to cause as much harm to the economy as possible, so that they could then blame all the difficulties on Bolshevism. It is the typical situation. The capitalists and their Menshevik hirelings have ruined the country due to their reactionary policies and due to their imperialist war. The communists come to power in the impoverished country, and immediately the capitalists and Mensheviks organize sabotage and blame the hard conditions on the communists. This is the typical method that they've used ever since. It is well known that after the October Revolution, all the state officials, bank officials, telegraphic operators, and other civil servants went on strike in order to resist the working class. With capitalist funding, this strike was able to go on for months. It was organized by the Mensheviks together with the capitalists. It was the same kind of strike as those organized by the CIA in Chile to try and topple Allende. Truly democratic. Even a certain capitalist writer, whose words are quoted in the Swiss Social Democrat paper Volksrecht, quite correctly stated that, quote, immediately after the accession of the Soviet government, a comprehensive sabotage set in. Directors, employees, and in some cases also the foremen of nationalized businesses went on strike. Brovkin himself writes, quote, the civil servant strike started in various departments in the first days of November. It is noteworthy that the employees of the Ministry of Labor, a bastion of defensist, that is, social imperialist Mensheviks, were among the most resolute organizers of the strike, which lasted nearly 2 months, with varying degrees of endurance in different departments. Unquote. The Mensheviks and SRs attacked the Bolsheviks, saying, you cannot govern, you do not have the necessary managerial skills, you've thrown the country into chaos, etc. But the chaos was often caused by the Mensheviks themselves, and they had done their best to deprive the Bolsheviks of management personnel as much as possible. The often barely literate workers had to quickly learn how to do everything themselves, as best they could, until after a couple of months the officials finally agreed to collaborate with the new workers' government. The Mensheviks loudly complained about nationalization and workers' control implemented by the Bolsheviks, but these policies were largely a response to the action of the Mensheviks and the capitalists. The Bolsheviks had to nationalize all the factories and let the workers manage them without any experts or managers, because the managers had refused to collaborate. It caused chaos, but there was nothing else that could be done, and eventually the workers beat the resistance of the bourgeois experts and succeeded in getting them to collaborate. The liberal writer H.G. Wells writes, quote, it was not communism that plunged this huge, creaking, bankrupt empire into 6 years of exhausting war. It was European imperialism. Nor is it communism that has pestered this suffering and perhaps dying Russia with a series of subsidized raids, invasions and insurrections, and inflicted upon it an atrocious blockade. The vindictive French creditor, the journalistic British oaf, are far more responsible for these deathbed miseries than any communist. Unquote. Even according to one Menshevik writer who had become critical of his party, the Bolsheviks were, quote, determined to put an end to the war and try by means of energetic economic measures to remedy the poverty situation. The Bolsheviks have not succeeded in these two things, but fate, not they, are to blame. We must admit without exception that the organization that has been created is quite insufficient, but the fault falls upon other shoulders, particularly on those of the intellectuals who sabotaged this reorganization. It is certain that only they, the Bolsheviks, dared to save Russia by their own force out of this extraordinarily difficult situation, and to oppose the old imperialism and to throw into the masses the torch of social revolution. Disregarding the gigantic effort of the Bolsheviks in the field of education, their rule as such has a magic influence on the masses. Without doubt, the material situation of the workers has grown considerably worse during the past few years, since Russia was generally impoverished. Without doubt, the struggle for existence is today much more difficult than it was, and yet the mass of the Russian workers rallies to the Soviet power, since it is their own power, since thanks to this power they have attained an entirely different social position, unquote. When they were in power, the Mensheviks and SRs opposed all strikes as anarchy and called for firm discipline. They did not want the workers to fight for their rights, because that would disturb Russia's participation in the imperialist war. But under the Soviet power, the Mensheviks and SRs began always calling for strikes. They claimed that nationalization was reactionary, but under the NEP they also called the ending of nationalization a disastrous and dangerous policy and a betrayal of socialism. Yet at the same time as they attacked the NEP because it strengthened capitalism, they also demanded that capitalist newspapers should be allowed. They criticized and attacked the Bolsheviks in every way they could, but fewer and fewer people believed their lies. Now, this is a bit of a side tangent, but I don't really know where else to put it, and it is interesting. So let's take a look at what the Mensheviks thought about the NEP, since some anti-communist historians claim that the NEP was actually the idea of the Mensheviks and that the Bolsheviks just stole the idea, or that the Mensheviks supported the NEP, but both of those are false. It's true that the Mensheviks wanted the restoration of capitalism, and the NEP allowed some capitalism to exist temporarily, but in reality the Mensheviks also opposed the NEP. However, based on the kinds of criticisms the Mensheviks made, it sounds like those criticisms are quite dishonest, that they just try to criticize the Bolsheviks no matter what they do. If the Bolsheviks adopt one policy, the Mensheviks oppose it, and even if the Bolsheviks were to adopt the opposite policy, the Mensheviks would still oppose it. Simon Volin writes that, quote, "In practice, however, the NEP had little in common with the Menshevik proposals. The Mensheviks came to see that the NEP, though an improvement over war communism in their opinion, was of little value without political reform, and the Menshevik newspaper, Socialistische Vestnik, wrote that the NEP was a quote-unquote lifeless thing," unquote. Liebig writes that, quote, "Observers have been at a loss to explain the apparent contradiction between Menshevik support of the idea of the NEP and rejection of the NEP itself," unquote. And I think it is because of two reasons. It's because the Mensheviks wanted to oppose the Bolsheviks no matter what the Bolsheviks did, but also because the Mensheviks most of all wanted the restoration of the bourgeois dictatorship. So they also wanted the restoration of the capitalist economy, but most of all they were unhappy that even if the Bolsheviks allowed capitalism economically to exist, at least temporarily, the power was still in the hands of the worker state and not in the hands of a capitalist state. Liebig continues, quote, "Mensheviks also quarreled with Bolsheviks over the degree of state capitalism, or socialism in Bolshevik parlance, that existed in Soviet Russia." I'm not gonna get into that terminological dispute. He's confusing everything, but it's not worth it to get into it right now. He continues, he says that Martov had warned that Bolsheviks had capitulated before capitalism to a far greater degree than necessary, and the remaining state sector was so isolated and weak that it was not viable. In Menshevik Dalin's words, it was like an English lord's park or an American millionaire's garden, a pseudo-productive idle luxury with no economic justification, unquote. I just find it super interesting and super ironic that these people who say that trying to build socialism is madness, trying to take power for the workers is madness, that they should just restore capitalism, when the Bolsheviks allow even a temporary and limited kind of capitalism to exist, then these people say, whoa, you're going way too far, you're destroying socialism. It's just so interesting and ironic to see these people try to make a pseudo-leftist critique of Bolshevism. But it wasn't just the Mensheviks, the SRs actually did a similar turnabout. So according to the SR leadership, quote, "The NEP offered concrete evidence of the counter-revolutionary essence of the Bolshevik dictatorship," unquote. And according to Broido, quote, "In May 1924, a new Menshevik party program was adopted in Berlin and was published by the Socialist Courier as the platform of the RSDRP. It warned that the NEP must not be allowed to restore capitalism," unquote. Again, amazing. and Menshevik Dalin writes the following, quote, "Moreover, Lenin had decided to compromise with experts who know how to organize industry. In short, his communism was a fiasco. The government was openly adopting a bourgeois capitalist policy, which in itself would not be so bad for the workers, except that this return to capitalism was going on in forms that delivered the Russian proletariat tied hand and foot to capitalist exploitation." David Dalin, also a member of the Menshevik CC, filled out the picture. Only one class in Russia has benefited and been strengthened by the external and domestic events, the well-to-do peasantry. It will take the helm of Russia's government. It will be the state power. Unquote. What garbage analysis. According to Marxism, it's not even possible to have a peasant state. But anyway, let's move on. All that being said, let's examine what factors caused dissatisfaction with the Soviet government, or even protests or even peasant revolts against the Soviet government. The biggest reasons for these were food shortages in the cities, confiscation of food from the peasants in the countryside, and conscription. These were genuine reasons that caused many people to be unhappy, but usually they understood why those things happened and accepted them. Workers usually understood that food was scarce because of war devastation, backwardness of the economy, etc. Historians recognize that already after waging war for a couple of years, cities of the Tsarist Empire started to suffer from starvation. The situation only kept getting worse the longer the war lasted. Many factories also had to close because of lack of fuel. Both food and fuel shortages were caused by war devastation, but were made much worse by the embargo, and also the imperialists tried to help the whites capture as many sources of food and fuel away from the Soviet government. Usually the workers understood the real causes of these things, despite Menshevik attempts to spread lies and to wage discontent. However, peasants oftentimes had no idea that there even was an embargo, as Bertrand Russell said. Russell further writes, quote, "The peasants are too ignorant to have any national consciousness, such as one takes for granted in England or France or Germany. The peasants will not willingly part with a portion of their produce merely for purposes of national defense, but only for the goods that they need." Unquote. The peasants were unhappy that they had to give food for the cities and for the Red Army, and also that they had to be conscripted, but they were usually willing to do it. A bourgeois writer named William Good writes, quote, "When the Red Army passes, the poor peasants assist it with food. They see that their interests are linked with the retention of Soviet power. It had previously been frankly confessed to me that there have been risings of peasants, and that the cause was confessed with equal frankness. A year ago, in dire straits for food for the center of Russia, owing to the blockade and the advancing ring of enemies, the Soviets had to send commissaries and soldiers into the countryside to take the food. The necessity was great and something had to be done, but the doing of it gave great umbrage to the peasants concerned." Unquote. The peasants didn't always understand the reasons behind those things, but both food requisitioning and conscription were things that all the armies in Russia did, not just the Bolsheviks. As a result, the peasants consistently preferred the Bolsheviks over any others. For them, the main difference between the Bolsheviks and the whites was that the whites wanted to restore the power of the landlords, and generally restored the Tsarist methods of rule, the so-called land captains, or zemsky nachalniks, local Tsarist dictators who flogged the peasants and treated them like serfs. As a result, though the workers volunteered for the Red Army more readily, the peasants also volunteered to join the Reds when the White Army approached. Some anti-communist historians claim that the Bolsheviks shouldn't have requisitioned food from the peasants, but many sources also say that it was clearly the only option. The Mensheviks and Whites also tried to create rebellions among peasants in the Red territories by calling for free trade, but in the territories they themselves occupied, the Whites also confiscated food and didn't rely on free trade because it was impractical, so this argument cannot be taken seriously. Bertrand Russell writes, quote, "If this policy of free trade were adopted, the towns would be faced by utter starvation, not merely by hunger and hardship." Unquote. Let's talk about food requisitioning in more detail. The Bolsheviks organized food detachments and also committees of the poor peasants to help requisition food. Social Democrat writer Price says that, quote, "At first these committees of the poorer peasantry met with resistance in the villages. Rebellions against the Republic broke out in many districts and were fomented by the agents of the German government and other governments, as the document published by the Extraordinary Commission for the Fight with the Counter-Revolution proves. Just as the Vendée and the Champagne revolt against the proletariat and the small bourgeoisie of Paris in the French Revolution were aided by a British naval expedition which blockaded the French coast in the interests of the so-called real France, so now the wealthy and ignorant part of the Russian peasantry struck against the urban workers and the half-proletariat, and were assisted by the ruling classes of England, who proved true once more to their traditions as suppressors of all movements for freedom in Europe, by conspiring to overthrow the popular movement in Russia. But the peasant revolts in the central provinces were put down by the Soviet government. Stern revolutionary discipline was enforced, and the saying of Mirabeau was confirmed, "Angels are not made out of butter in the time of revolution." Unquote. The Mensheviks tried to use all the genuine hardships caused by the war to spread dissatisfaction in order to overthrow the Bolshevik state. There were also other, more occasional reasons for popular dissatisfaction and protests. Especially the Right-SRs tried to take advantage of the ignorance of the peasants to get them to turn against the Bolsheviks. For example, the peasants knew that Lenin had given them land, so the Right-SR said that Lenin was actually with them and not a communist. Among some peasants, they used the slogan, "Down with the communists, long live Comrade Lenin," as capitalist historian Telitsin has written. According to Brovkin, Right-SRs and Kulak rebels told the peasants, quote, "The Bolsheviks and the communists are different. The Bolsheviks and the communists struggle against each other. The communists want to unite the peasants by force into agricultural communes. The communists want to liquidate the church, and finally, the communists have replaced Soviet power by their own power. From here follows a logical conclusion. It is necessary to help the Bolsheviks struggle against communists and Jews. It is necessary to struggle for Soviet power against the dictatorship of the communists." Unquote. A certain anti-communist historian says that, quote, "Some rebels, clearly under SR leadership, used the slogans, 'Death to the communists,' 'Long live the People's Freedom Party,' and 'Long live the Constituent Assembly.' However, this slogan did not have any noticeable impact," unquote. And indeed, the peasants never seemed to care about the Constituent Assembly, and were not particularly party-minded either. The SR party might even be the only party that they knew about, and still, even their support for the Right SR party was often very nominal. According to a capitalist historian, Russian peasants were very susceptible to reactionary rumors, which sometimes were not caused by the communists in any way. He writes, quote, "Dissatisfaction based on short-term interest or constantly changing moods, caused not so much by political as by everyday factors, for example the envy of neighbor to neighbor due to rumors about his exemption from duties, village to village due to alleged free transfer of textiles and salt to one of them, volost to volost, talking about allocation of free agricultural equipment, seeds, etc. Rumors for the most part remain rumors, but just one word about the privileged, even hypothetically, position of a neighbor was enough for peasant grumbling to result in open discontent." Unquote. Sometimes peasant rebellions were sparked due to mistakes or outright wrong behavior by the communists or the Cheka. There were several possible reasons for this. The Cheka was sometimes infiltrated by the class enemies, Tsarist police, Right SR, or corrupt people. Capitalist historian Telitsin writes that a Cheka official from Central Russia in 1920 discusses the class enemies there, mentioning among them, quote, "white officers, senior police element. This group consists of old officials, police officers, bailiffs and gendarmes who hid their past, on the one hand, and the sediment of Kolchakism, Dudovshchina, Denikism and other so-called caliphs for an hour, a muddy sediment that remained in almost all the outskirts, on the other hand, and they often attached themselves to Soviet power, even occupying responsible positions." Unquote. According to a diary from a Russian White Guard, the white punitive detachments which attacked villages also sometimes pretended to be Reds, so that the peasants would put the blame on the communists. An article called "The Party Cleaning in Russia" writes that, quote, "The sad fact is generally admitted that the Russian Communist Party had been permeated by many undesirable elements who made use of the prestige this party enjoyed in Russia for their personal purposes or for obtaining certain privileges. Thus, the Russian Communist Party in the course of the last few years has admitted far too many petty bourgeois elements, having nothing in common with communism, who entered the party merely because that step was necessary in order to enable them to occupy some official post. The Russian communists have been continually struggling with certain adventurers, climbers, bureaucrats, even criminals, who had in some way or other wormed their way into the ranks of the party, and who were a source of discredit to the organization among the masses of the people, and who in other ways inflicted injuries to the movement. The most important point is that all the cleaning up meetings of the party were attended also by large crowds of non-partisan workers. The fate of a communist has thus often been decided by the verdict of a non-partisan colleague. The following sometimes took place. A few so-called communists, whose consciences were not quite clear, would agree among themselves before the meeting to keep quiet about certain things. This calculation, however, was usually upset by the honest workers, who, without having become members of the Communist Party, were nevertheless disinclined to tolerate corruption in the party. The cleaning up eliminated not only these elements that were directly harmful, such as usurers, bribe-taking Soviet employees, disguised counter-revolutionists, but also such elements as indirectly injured the prestige of the party and the Soviet power in the eyes of the people, such as drunkards, idlers, etc. The great mass of those excluded, however, consisted of petty bourgeois elements who had been in the party but a short time." Unquote. The Cheka and the communists also sometimes made genuine mistakes. For example, although the uprising in Kostroma had been engineered by the White Guards, the Cheka still analyzed its causes and made the following criticisms against the Soviet officials. Quote, 1. Lack of party work, and 2. Inability and often criminal actions of local representatives of the Soviet government, executive committees and committees of the poor. These inept actions were determined either by the illiteracy and simple ignorance of Soviet workers on the ground, or were carried out deliberately aimed at discrediting the Soviet government by the members of the old Tsarist-era police forces and officials who had been able to remain inside the city administration to an extent. An investigation committee also noted that at the center of the uprising in Urensko, in some Soviets, the entire executive committees had been infiltrated by criminal class enemies, while trying to gain credibility by labeling themselves as Bolsheviks. Quote, in one of the volos of the Kostroma district, Karimovskaya, a meeting of village committees was scheduled for December 5th to approve a tax of 500,000 rubles distributed among the peasants of the volost. All willing peasants came to the meeting, according to the attendance list, 194 people. The meeting decided the tax of 500,000 rubles should be rejected due to the fact that there are no wealthy peasants in our volost, therefore there is no one to tax. A negative decision was also made on the supply of horses and cattle due to the fact that there are no extra horses and cows. In other words, the peasant village meeting decided that they don't want to give horses to the Red Army because they don't have enough. He continues, the behavior of the secretary of the Volost Council, A.M. Godnev, caused particular indignation among the peasants for the arbitrariness he allowed during the apportionment of taxes, as well as the chairman of the Karimov Committee of the Poor, A.A. Babanov, who took away bread and potatoes not only from the middle peasants but also from the poor. Completely without remuneration, both were expelled from their positions as oppressors and discreditors of the authorities. Nevertheless, the Cheka arrested 11 people from the village of Klobushnevo, the village of Tereshkino, and others in this case. But as a result of the investigation, the commission decided to terminate the case due to lack of evidence against the accused. Unquote. So in that example, for instance, there were some Soviet officials who were either corrupt or just negligent, and they were both fired from their position as a result. And although the Cheka arrested some people without proper reason, those people were eventually released. A capitalist historian writes that after the Makarevsky revolt ended, quote, the investigative commission of the Revolutionary Tribunal, having analyzed the events here, came to the conclusion that there was no fair treatment for the rebellious and confused peasants. The commission's report notes that on the part of the punitive detachment, punishment often turned into real mockery, reminiscent of the old bourgeois police regime, which did not strengthen but completely discredited Soviet power. During the unrest in Makarev, power passed into the hands of the military operational headquarters headed by Commissar Kitov, later convicted by a tribunal for embezzlement and abuse. The punitive detachment had been headed by two former police officers, Gribin and Budakov, the secretary of the headquarters, who abused their position, threatened people, and stole money and food for themselves. Unquote. In the above case, the Cheka discovered the truth, punished the corrupt people, and did not take any legal action against the peasants, even though the peasants had engaged in a revolt. but it was understood that they had been provoked by these criminal elements. Such grumblings usually did not escalate to a revolt. The communist authorities and peasants were usually able to come to an agreement. In another incident, peasants from the villages of Zashilsky, Davidov, Khlyapshin and others gathered in the Volost center and beat up a Red Army conscription official and a militiaman. Quote, on May 24, 1919, the Investigative Commission of the Revolutionary Tribunal issued a resolution to terminate this case and amnesty the peasants, since their actions here were not of an organized nature. Unquote. There was unrest among the peasants in the Spasskaya Volost due to the decree separating the church from the state, but the Bolshevik investigative authorities determined that the local communists had acted in a way which had insulted religious sensibilities, and thus, quote, the case was also dismissed by the provincial tribunal, which qualified the actions of the council representatives as tactless and insulting the feelings of the believers, unquote. According to Telitsin, quote, the presence of even a minimal political sense among the authorities made it possible to quickly find a common language with the villagers, and that, as a rule, was where it all ended. An example of such a situation is the event that took place in July 1918 in the Kostkovskaya Volost of Demyansky district, Novgorod province. Here about 1,000 peasants came to the building of the Demyansk district soviet to demand bread and seeds. But there was no outburst of discontent since, after some explanation given by the chairman of the Soviet about the state of affairs in terms of food, the arriving citizens regained their senses and calmly went home. Unquote. Despite the fact that corrupt individuals and class enemies tried to infiltrate the Cheka, as a rule the Cheka consisted of honest people, and especially the leaders were veteran revolutionaries who had devoted their lives to the cause of the revolution. According to Morizet, quote, as for the provincial Chekas, the following figures will show how they are constituted. A conference of their presidents and vice presidents was held at Moscow. Of the 69 who were present, there were 45 workers, 13 peasants and 11 intellectuals. All were party members, and 28 of them had already been party members under the Tsar. It is not among this personnel of devoted revolutionists that you will find the undesirable elements. Unfortunately, however, the subaltern functionaries cannot be recruited quite so scrupulously. To be sure, there is a large proportion of communists, but there are also those who are not communists. In spite of the inadequacy of its ranks, which is due to the general low standard of popular education, to which those abuses, which have really occurred, must be assigned, we could not, in full justice, form that opinion of the Cheka which one would hold if one should put faith in all those fables that have been handed out. Unquote. The Cheka shot 15,000 people during the whole civil war of 4 years, while the French bourgeoisie massacred double that, so 30,000 people, in the 8 days following the collapse of the Paris Commune, and the Finnish bourgeoisie killed approximately the same number of people in the White Terror within a matter of months after the collapse of the Finnish Workers' Revolution. If the people suffered from shortages of food, so did the communists. Conditions during 1918 up to the 1920s were so hard, even for the Bolshevik rulers, that they, mostly, with the exception of maybe some corrupt individuals, lived in cold, damp and dark rooms, slept and ate little, as Kollontai says in her memoirs. Kollontai actually says in her memoirs that she felt a lot of nostalgia for her émigré days before the revolution, because the conditions were so bad. Visitors also said that Foreign Affairs Commissar Chicherin looked like he was starving to death. President of the Republic, Sverdlov, and the leader of the Bolshevik women's section, Armand, both died of preventable disease during the Civil War, as also did the famous communist activist John Reed. The book The Bullet Mission to Russia, which was prepared by American diplomats, writes the following, quote, everyone is hungry in Moscow and Petrograd, including the people's commissaries themselves. The daily ration of Lenin and the other commissaries is the same as that of a soldier in the army or a workman at hard labor. In the hotel which is reserved for government officials, the menu is the following. Breakfast, a quarter to half a pound of black bread, which must last all day, and tea without sugar. Dinner, a good soup, a small piece of fish, for which occasionally a diminutive piece of meat is substituted, a vegetable, either a potato or a bit of cabbage, more tea without sugar. Supper, what remains of the morning ration of bread, and more tea without sugar. Unquote. H.G. Wells writes that, quote, the general spirit of Bolshevism is quite honest, and it is set very stoutly against looting and such like. unquote. And whatever else we may say to the discredit of the Bolshevik leaders, it is undeniable that the great majority lead not simply laborious but puritanical lives, unquote. McBride writes, quote, "In all the villages I visited, I found the peasants faring much better than were the commissars in Moscow," unquote. And why is that? Well, in the villages, there's firewood, and there's also food. It might be interesting to make a video in the future about the Red Army and why people joined it and why people did not want to join it and some people deserted from it. But let's take a look at it briefly. So, why did some soldiers, mainly peasants, desert from the Red Army? Did they do it because they hated communism and wanted to join the whites? Well, the answer is blatantly no. Anti-communist historian Figes writes the following, quote, "The large number of deserters surrendering voluntarily highlights the economic as opposed to the political motivation of the majority of the peasant desertions, what the Soviet authorities termed desertions of a non-malicious or politically unconscious kind, whereas the deserters from the White Army rarely returned to it or even joined the Reds. Those from the Red Army could sometimes be persuaded to return to the front." Also known to be effective in this respect were the amnesty weeks declared during special propaganda campaigns in aid of the Red Army when deserters were given the opportunity to return to the ranks without punishment. The mainly economic character of the peasant desertions was reflected in the causes of the latter. The primary motivation of the peasant deserter was to return to their farm for the harvest. According to one survey, the number of deserters in the Volga region at the peak of the 1919 harvest season, August, was 5 to 7 times greater than during the previous April. The same survey found that 44% of the deserters from Tambov, Ryazan, Tula and Moscow provinces during January to May 1919 had run away because their unit was close to their home village, while a further 23% had deserted because their unit had been assigned to leave for the front. A second common motivation was the deserters' concern for the well-being of their families. A third major cause of desertion from the Red Army was the chronic supply of food, unquote, etc. So the peasants, they were worried about their family, they wanted to stop their farm from being ruined or stop their family from going hungry. That's why these desertions were called non-malicious and were not necessarily punished. Although at first, many peasants were quite unhappy about military service, basing their view on the experiences from the Tsarist era, they eventually became satisfied with the Red Army. Peasant soldiers actually usually preferred being in the army instead of returning to the primitive life of the villages. A Western bourgeois writer, H.N. Brailsford, writes that after the Civil War, quote, "The Red Army, on the contrary, is popular. To enter it means opportunity, promotion, and education," unquote. The Bullet Mission to Russia writes the following, quote, "The whole spirit of the Red Army appears to be very high, particularly since its recent successes. The soldiers no longer have the beaten, dog-like look which distinguished them under the Tsar, but carry themselves like free men and curiously like Americans. They are popular with the people. The testimony was universal that recruiting for the army is easiest in the districts which, having once lived under the Soviets, were overrun by anti-Soviet forces and then reoccupied by the Red Army," unquote. In other words, there were the most volunteers in places which had experienced both sides, both the Reds and the Whites, and then, surprise surprise, in increasing numbers they volunteer for the Reds. Paul Birukov, who is a Tolstoyan pacifist writer, says the following, quote, "The Russian peasants are as a rule conservative and do not trouble themselves much about the forms of government. A good many fables have been told about the peasants' love for the little father, the Tsar. We have seen in our own experience that the downfall of the Tsar aroused no protest from them. As we said above, the present government, that's the Soviet government, had won the confidence of the peasants by issuing decrees giving them peace and land. The renewal of the war, which had been forced upon the government, and the subsequent mobilization have done a good deal to make the people lose confidence in the new government, but it has no thought at all of overthrowing this government. The revolts of the peasants, which took place during last winter, were fomented by revolutionary agitators belonging to parties opposed to the government. It would be more accurate to say counter-revolutionary agitators, but anyway, let's continue. He says, but these revolts, serious though they were put down without difficulty. The richer elements among the peasants are opposed to the government, but they are in exactly the same measure enemies of the people, oppressors of the people. They and the small bourgeoisie of the towns were the strongest supporters of the Tsarism, and it is from these elements that the party of the Black Hundreds was recruited." Unquote. Berukov says quite accurately that the Bolsheviks initially rallied only the poor peasant committees to support them, but since 1919, or perhaps somewhat earlier, broadened their appeal also to the middle peasants. Then let's talk about changes in the class composition of the masses and changes in the proletariat, and changes in the population. Another factor which could have temporarily helped Mensheviks and SRs and temporarily could have weakened the Bolsheviks was that millions of workers left the cities during the Civil War, and in fact they were doing it even before the Civil War. On the one hand, the poorest proletarians and semi-proletarians went to the countryside in order to get food and became declassed or peasantized, while the most conscious communist workers either volunteered for the Red Army and left for the battlefronts, or joined the Communist Party and were sent away on party tasks. Both of those things weakened the Bolsheviks. Later, Communist Party organizations and factories were also frequently told to mobilize more and more of their workers for the war. This left an increasing proportion of politically backward workers and also wealthier workers in the cities. Meanwhile, the ruined bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie had to seek employment and also entered the factories, and thus became proletarians. But if you were a capitalist or a petty bourgeois yesterday and you are a worker today, you're still going to think like a capitalist, you're not going to be very class conscious. This change in the composition of the city working population was extremely worrying to the communists and of course had an impact on Menshevik activity. According to a capitalist historian named Koenker, quote, "Bolshevik leaders feared that the proletariat that demonstrated such revolutionary class consciousness in 1917 was becoming declassed as a result of the economic pressures and dislocations of the Civil War." Unquote. And John Keep writes, quote, "The men who made the October Revolution, insofar as they were civilians and not soldiers, were soon dissipated to the four winds. Their place would eventually be filled by men who came straight from the village and were cast in a different mold." Unquote. And this is something that people don't really think about when they notice some kind of change in the views of the working class. One of the best examples is the Kronstadt mutiny, because reactionaries so often say, oh, the Kronstadt sailors were the most revolutionary, and then 4 years later they turn against the Bolsheviks. But they don't realize that in the course of those 4 years, the membership of the Kronstadt military base has completely changed, probably many times over. So it's not the same people. As an example of this, quote, "Over 3 years of the Civil War, the Nizhny Novgorod party organization held 10 mobilizations and sent several thousand communists to many numerical fronts of the Civil War." Unquote. Imagine how it must weaken the party organization and how difficult it is to maintain a party organization if you have to send a good bulk or even most of your members to different fronts of the Civil War 10 times. Victor Serge writes that in 1918, quote, "The Petrograd Soviet has resolved to send a quarter of its members to the Czechoslovak front." Unquote. According to Brovkin, out of 15,000 Communist Party members in Petrograd in 1919, almost 10,000 were sent away to the fronts or other party tasks away from factories. And according to Soviet historian Medvedev, during Kolchak's general offensive in Syzran district, 50% of the communists were mobilized and 25% of all union members, while Simbirsk announced 100% mobilization of communists, and in Pokrovsk the trade unions mobilized 50% of their members. So all the most conscious workers and most organized and active workers were constantly being sent away from the workplaces to the fronts of the Civil War. And anti-communist historian Feinsod sums up the situation by saying that, quote, "From a third to a half of the total Communist Party membership was sent into the Red Army during the Civil War period." Unquote. And Koenker writes that, quote, "Among men, skilled workers suffered the greatest numerical losses, although in percentages these losses were less than among semi-skilled or unskilled workers. It is this group that included the most committed of the revolutionary activists of 1917. Indeed, a different set of figures that permits comparison of 1920 and 1917 shows that the number of metal workers, the quintessential urban proletarian activists, declined in Moscow by almost 40,000 or 66%. 25,000 of these left between 1917 and August 1918. Like Moscow's, Petrograd's losses included large numbers of skilled and valuable long-time workers. In fact, none left in such great numbers, both absolute and relative, as the skilled metal workers. Evidence suggests that the overwhelming majority of Moscow's skilled workers were lost to the Red Army itself." Unquote. So she's demonstrating that the most class-conscious workers ended up in the Red Army and thus left the workplace and left the cities temporarily. Quote, "Red Army recruits were overwhelmingly young, unmarried and childless. Workers of this type had enthusiastically supported Soviet power in 1917, and their physical absence from the city would clearly affect the political climate. Evidence confirms the common-sense assumption that the skilled workers who stayed in the city and continued to work were older family men. They were less likely to have been Bolshevik supporters than their younger brothers or sons. Older workers had tended to support the Menshevik Party in 1917. The Menshevik resurgence in 1918 was made possible in part by the Red Army's mobilization and removal from the urban political scene of the activist young workers." Unquote. So Konker believes in this relative quote-unquote Menshevik resurgence in 1918. How real that was, well, that's kind of the topic of this video. I don't think it was very real, or very substantial at least. But in any case, as she says, the relative weakening of the Bolsheviks in the cities and the relative strengthening of anti-Bolsheviks wouldn't have been necessarily the result of the workers turning against the Bolsheviks. It's simply that the more class-conscious workers leave the cities. Brovkin and other anti-communist hacks have always claimed that the workers turned against the communists, but facts undeniably show that the masses continue to support the communists, and that, even though there were changes, these cannot be explained only by supposed changing moods of the workers, but also by literal change in the composition of the workers. The Petrograd workers of 1918 or 1919 were not the same as the Petrograd workers of 1917. According to J. Hatch, worker dissatisfaction was typically caused by fear of food shortages or by reduction of food supply. This fits the situation in early 1918 completely. He further says that, quote, "Bolshevik estrangement from the working class was not permanent. Worker dissatisfaction was spread by right-SRs and Mensheviks, but was only temporary." Hatch writes, quote, "Although the Communist Party was in no danger of losing the elections, the departure of pro-communist workers from the factories during the Civil War undermined communist influence over the working class." Unquote. Of course. He further says that the relatively higher support for other parties in Rogoshko-Simonovsky, which he says was 4%, which is not very high, in the early 1920s, were because their, quote, "major inroads were being made by the Communist Party's radical worker opposition," unquote, which was an opportunist ultra-left group of demagogues. So apparently that helped anti-communist parties. But yeah, he says that in the early 1920s, the relatively higher support for anti-communists in that particular place was still only 4%. Hatch says that the increase of opposition and lowering of support for Bolsheviks among workers during that period was because the working class changed. Thousands of workers went back for long periods to the countryside, becoming D-class. The number of workers in general simply diminished, and the number of the other classes increased in relation. The most politically conscious pro-Bolshevik workers joined the Red Army and also left for the front, this relatively increasing the number of non-workers and less politically active workers. The exodus of workers to the countryside also caused economic problems, which worsened discontent. He writes, quote, "It had to do with the extensive changes in the composition of the Moscow working class that had taken place since 1917. In purely quantitative terms, this change was remarkable. During the Civil War years, the number of industrial workers in Moscow declined from 190,000 to 85,000. This decline resulted from several factors, including the departure of thousands of skilled, younger pro-Bolshevik workers from the factories to either the front or work in various party and administrative agencies, and the exodus to the villages of tens of thousands of additional workers seeking to escape Moscow's economic collapse." Unquote. And he further says that because Bolshevik workers and party members had been sent to the front, quote, "industrial party organizations had become woefully under strength." Unquote. Alright, that's all for now. Next time I'll probably talk about who the supporters of Menshevism and Bolshevism were, and after that this series should be pretty much at an end. I'll make a video about the Izhevsk revolt sometime in the future, and I also want to make a video about the dissolving of the Constituent Assembly by the Bolsheviks, but I probably won't get to those very soon as I have so many other projects going. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you later.